Well, last week we heard the story of Jacob, a conniving character that persevered and caught a blessing from his wrestling match with God. And this week our story centers around Moses, specifically his call story, his encounter with the living God in a burning bush, a bush that was on fire but was not consumed. But before we jump right into Moses, it's important to fill in the gaps of the story just a little bit, because we skipped right over Joseph, and he's a pretty important character. His story takes up 13 chapters in the book of Genesis. Joseph is Jacob's youngest and most beloved son. And he's important because, well, he is the reason that the Israelites are in Egypt in the first place. So some of you may be familiar with this. Joseph's 11 brothers are so jealous of him and the very special place that he holds in their father Jacob's heart that they sell him into slavery. And so he is taken to Egypt, where many different things happen to him, but ultimately he ends up as a special advisor to the Pharaoh. And then when Israel and all of Egypt's neighbors suffer a famine, Joseph's entire family, all of the Israelite people at that time, come to reside in Egypt, which, thanks to Joseph's careful planning, has plenty of food stored away so that the famine does not affect Egypt. But eventually, as we hear at the beginning of today's reading, a Pharaoh comes to power that does not know Joseph and does not know the story of Joseph. So now the Pharaoh doesn't know that the Israelites are actually responsible for having saved them from the famine that plagued all of their neighbors. And instead, all this current Pharaoh seems to know is that the Israelites are growing stronger and more numerous by the minute. And so, this Pharaoh is afraid. And because of that fear, he decides to enslave the people. And not only that, he instructs all of the midwives to kill all the boy babies born to Hebrew women. Now, the midwives refuse to do this, an important part of the story that I'll get to in a minute. But this gives you a little bit of an understanding of the world that Moses was caught up in. And you may also remember that because Pharaoh had given this order to have all the Hebrew boy babies killed, Moses himself is placed in a basket in the river and found by Pharaoh's daughter. By the time the living God calls out to Moses from the burning bush, Moses has fled Egypt and is living as a shepherd in the wilderness. And Moses himself is afraid because he killed an Egyptian taskmaster that was mistreating his people. Well, back in my advocacy days, I spent a lot of time talking and teaching about the story of Moses' call, about the many times in Moses' faith journey, including here, where he questions his ability to lead God's people and to speak truth to power, to confront Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." And how despite all of this, despite Moses' inadequacies and despite his objections, God calls him anyway. But I didn't intend for today to be an advocacy sermon, because there's so much in this story, so much good stuff to focus on. And then there was Thursday's shooting at a community college in rural Oregon. And on Thursday night, as I was scrolling through my Facebook news feed on my phone, friend after friend after friend was literally crying out to God. When will this end? When will this violence stop? What can we do, God? What can we do? Why? Why does this keep happening to us? One after another after another. And all we're saying, a variation of this same thing. When? When will it stop? Why? Why? How long? Oh God, how long? It was a feeling of total helplessness. Now, I know that not all of my friends have the same thoughts and feelings about this issue, and I know that that's certainly true of this community as well. But to me, at that moment, the cries of my friends, of people in this country, the cries felt as numerous and as relentless and as helpless as I imagine those of the enslaved Israelites. And though we may disagree about what to do about this problem, the hard truth that we are afraid to face is that too many lives are being lost. We are literally enslaved and oppressed by our addiction to guns. And many of us, no matter which side of the political debate that we are on, we feel completely powerless to do anything to stop it, because the two sides cannot come together, and so nothing happens. The power against us seems greater than anything we can imagine. And then a strange thing happened as I was reading their cries, their prayers, their pleas. I began to hear clearly and loudly the promise and the call from the burning bush. I have observed the misery of my people, the living God says. I have heard their cry. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them. Now, I don't know how you feel when you hear these words in relation to this topic, but for the first time in a long time, I heard and I felt hope. I really believe that God hears us, and I really believe that God has come down to deliver us. And so the question then that this story poses for me is this: are we paying attention? Are we paying attention and turning our faces towards the call from the living God to save the lives of our nation's children? Or do we turn away in fear? It's amazing to me how much fear creeps up in this story. And it's ultimately fear that is the downfall of the powerful. Pharaoh, if you'll remember, Pharaoh is afraid. But the women are not. They don't let their fear of Pharaoh get in their way of their fear for the Lord. And so the midwives, Sipporah and Puah, they risk their lives and defy Pharaoh's orders. And God protects them because they are on the side of life. And they're even able to use Pharaoh's fear in their favor, because after he finds out that they are not killing these baby boys, he brings them to him, and they say, the Hebrew women are so strong. They give birth before we are able to arrive, playing into his fear that they are strong and growing. even though, of course, that was not true, that they give birth before the midwives arrive. Even Pharaoh's daughter is unafraid in this story. She hears a little baby cry, and she sees the baby floating down the river, Moses, and she defers to their common humanity rather than her fear. And she's bold enough even to bring this Hebrew child into Pharaoh's palace. What strikes me also about this story is that when Moses first sees the burning bush, he's not afraid, even though this very strange thing is happening. We're told that he is curious, that he wants to know more, wants to know how it is that this bush is not consumed with fire. And the study notes in my Bible say that it's likely that Moses was out there searching for God, that he knew that he was in this holy place, that he was approaching holy ground. And so when he sees this burning bush, his initial reaction is, even though it is amazing and scary, he wants to know more. He turns his face toward it, towards God, towards the call. And yet, then the strange thing that happens is when that God confirms, yes, Moses, it's me. It's God, the God of Jacob, the God of Abraham. What does Moses do? He turns away. He turns away from the very thing, the very person that he was actually searching for, because he is afraid to look at God. And I feel like we have all been there. Do you know what I mean? I have been there. We feel that God is calling us somewhere, and we want answers, and we want to help. And so we dip our toes in a little bit. We're curious. We want to know more. And then, just as quickly, we turn away from that very thing that we were searching for, because for whatever reason we are afraid of what comes next, afraid of what we might learn or what we might be asked to do. Every so often, a news story like the one from this past Thursday will compel us to action, right? We will pray and we will hear so strongly that God is calling us to do something, and so we will write a letter to our congressman, or we'll sign a petition, or we will give money to support a cause or a crisis or even a candidate. And then the more we get involved, the closer we get to the fire, our fear creeps in and begins to take over. And we find ourselves saying, who am I? Who am I? I couldn't possibly play a big part in this. I'm not qualified. I'll leave it to someone else. I don't want to get burned. Thankfully, God continues to call even when Moses has turned away. Just as God continues to call us and continues to give us the promise even when our face is turned away. When it's too much, when we just can't read the news stories anymore, when we can't let ourselves think about it anymore. The voice of the living God is relentless. I hear you. I'm coming. You will be delivered. God even protects Moses and warns him, do not come any closer, God says. And yet at the same time, he invites Moses to take off his sandals, to rest in this holy place, on this holy ground. And so as I've sat with this image of the burning bush all week, of Moses' encounter with the living God, present in fire but not consumed, I cannot help but feel called and invited to be still in the presence of the Lord, to breathe deeply, and to keep my face turned away from everything that makes me fearful, and instead towards the living God. This God that I have always been curious about my whole life. This God who is no doubt delivering us from everything that enslaves and oppresses us. But I am aware that this is no easy task. The truth of this story is that freedom can be a scary thing, right? Parents of teenagers know this, and probably even teenagers themselves, right? Freedom can sometimes be scary because no matter how bad our reality, no matter how much we want to be free of something and to move forward, we have this innate fear as humans of the unknown. What if the future isn't any better? After all, in just a few chapters, the Israelites themselves will be longing for the days of slavery, right? They complain, why did you bring us out of slavery just to die here of hunger in the wilderness? They're cold and frightened, and they don't know where they are going. There is always something to fear, and that fear is often very real and very legitimate. And yet God invites us, God calls us to focus instead on his presence with us. And it's so funny when Moses says, "Who am I to do this?" God doesn't actually even answer that question. All God says is, "I will be with you." God invites us not to turn away, but instead to sit with those who have experienced the tragedy of gun violence firsthand, to see them and to listen to their stories. God calls us to be curious, to have a conversation with someone who you don't agree with on this issue or some other important issue that you are passionate about. God calls us to face that fear head on and actually talk and dialogue with one another. To ask tough questions like, what if more guns won't make us safer? And to ask that question in reverse for those of us who may have the opposite opinion. God calls us to cling to God's promises more than to our assumptions and our ideologies, whether they're liberal, conservative, or somewhere in between. This story is filled with ordinary people who did not let any fear control them except their fear of the Lord. And this is not an easy task, and we will never be perfect at it. But the promise of the burning bush is always there, calling us. I hear you. I'm coming. You will be delivered. Do not be afraid. Amen.